St. Petersburg. Founded by Peter the Great in the early 18th century, it was the capital of the Russian Empire until 1918. Its proximity to Europe made it the center of Russian culture and one of the hubs of the revolution that changed the country and the world forever. The city was built with one goal in mind: to showcase Russia's glory to the rest of the world. Everything here had to be bigger and more magnificent than anywhere else.
St. Petersburg is really the result of a cooperation between German, Italian, and French architects.
St. Petersburg's rich past has always been the pride of its people. Among its heritage stands one of the largest and most impressive museums in the world.
We have 3 million works of art at the Hermitage.
But just behind the city's breathtaking facades still lie the surreal vestiges of communism.
Сколько сейчас людей проживают в этой квартире?
13 человек. Это мало. Вот после войны здесь до 40 человек.
St. Petersburg was built, well, in the middle of nowhere. But Peter the Great, a master strategist, chose his location to ensure control over the Baltic Sea.
He was thinking about expanding trade to Western Europe, trade and cultural exchange, and in his opinion, that could only be done if Russia had access to a sea. He sent his armies down south to the Sea of Azov, where he successfully defeated the Turks first, but then it didn't quite work out as it became apparent that even the Sea of Azov doesn't guarantee you access to the Mediterranean. You still have to take Constantinople. Peter's attention was drawn to the Baltic. The eastern part of the Baltic coast was entirely under the control of Sweden. So a war was launched in 1700.
The economic potential of this hub between Russia and Europe was limited by its terrain, a constantly flooded marshland. Not exactly the ideal foundation for a rapid urban development.
How difficult was it to build this city in the middle of a bog?
We can speculate about it, but it's impossible to imagine. There was no population here, so tens of thousands of men had to be summoned here by force, against their will in most cases, complete with their families, of course. So it was an enormous shift of the population from all over the empire. I see this picture of the Tsar in his high boots, surrounded by his men, standing in the middle of a swamp there and telling to his men that there should be a city built here. And they probably say, Peter, you're crazy. Look at this swamp, you're disappearing underwater as you speak. And he said something probably like, look guys, it's the end of May now, we still got June, July, August before it starts getting cold. So you better start digging now. And all these people were building something they really had no concept of, except for the Tsar and his architects and his engineers. They were hammering wooden logs into the ground to form banks for the future canals. Peter wanted his houses to look Dutch or French or Italian, but not Russian. A completely new approach to building, and men had to be instructed by someone, and it could only be really achieved by an outstanding manager. And I think it'll be proper to call Peter a good manager in today's language. He was curious to see how everything works, from gun making to shipbuilding to canal digging to anatomy and medicine. And then a few years later, the city was the capital of his new empire.
How many people died during the construction of St. Petersburg?
Scores. No one knows. Those were serfs in most cases, and no one was counting serfs. We can say tens of thousands safely.
The swamp was built up into 42 islands, all held together using granite. But you don't find granite in swamps, and a stone tax was imposed. If you wanted entrance to the city, you paid for it with stone.
If you sail back up 60-odd kilometers, you get to Lake Ladoga, which is the biggest lake in Europe. This river connects the sea to Lake Ladoga, and the Lake Ladoga connects to other lakes and other rivers across Russia, and that's what he thought was important, so that merchants could bring their goods. We have the network completed in the 20th century. Canals were dug connecting the lakes to the River Volga and to the White Sea, so today you can sail as far as Central Asia uninterrupted, right from here.
There are 519 bridges in St. Petersburg. That's 85 more than Venice. 6 of them are drawbridges, which give large vessels access to the interior of the country. But drawbridges, in the middle of a city of 5 million people, have a way of complicating things.
I remember when I was here in the 90s, getting stuck on the other side once because all the drawbridges went up. But now you have a new bridge, and it's the only permanent bridge that crosses the Neva.
Yes, each of the drawbridges has a fixed timetable, and each of them opens and closes at a certain time, and you have to sort of keep that timetable in mind, which is what most locals do. All drawbridges open up at night. If you're for some reason late for your drawbridge, you're stuck for about 3 hours before it comes down again. So say if you're stuck on this side of the river here and you want to cross to this side, and you rely on that permanent bridge, you take a taxi 30k down and then 30k up. And that makes little sense, because a 60-kilometer taxi ride.
St. Petersburg's structural challenges are more than just skin deep. Beneath the city lies the world's deepest subway system.
The reason they're so deep is that metro has to go under all the water, under the rivers, and under all the underground lakes, reaching a layer of more or less solid sort of clay and rock that's down beneath, and that's 60, 70 meters below ground level.
How many people use the St. Petersburg Metro every day?
Statistically, 2.4 million people per day.
Is the Metro the best way to get around St. Petersburg?
The metro is the best way to get from A to B if the A and B are quite far apart. There are not many stations inside the city center. It's actually quite difficult to build anything in the city center because of the water, because of the density of the historical monuments. So if you're commuting in or out of town, metro is the fastest way. Right now, escalators move at about 94 centimeters per second, so far as I know. Before that, let's say 2/3 of that. So instead of the 2.5 minutes it takes us now to get upstairs, it'll probably take about 4 minutes or so for one single escalator. So multiply that by 4, and you'll know how much a single person spends per day on the escalators going to and from work, using escalators 4 times a day. Multiply that by 5, and you get so much time per working week. That adds up to hours, days, and weeks of one's lifetime. So that's a lot of time spent on the escalators.
St. Petersburg's reputation as one of the world's most beautiful cities is a direct result of the larger-than-life imagination of its past leaders.
St. Petersburg is really the result of a cooperation between German, Italian, and French architects. That's why we consider St. Petersburg to be the most European of Russian cities. All streets and avenues are parallel and perpendicular, and the height of buildings in the center of the city was regulated. Nothing higher than the Winter Palace. This was done to maintain the horizontal aspect of the city. That's the charm of St. Petersburg.
In true Russian style, the city's charm lies in the size of its features. Nothing small here. The immense, sprawling design of the gardens of Peterhof is a prime example of the competitive nature of the city's founders.
Originally, it was the second home of Peter the Great. The idea was not only to copy Versailles, but also to create a larger residence. Here in the gardens of Peterhof, there are over 150 water fountains. That's more than in Florence. All these fountains are fed by underground springs that are located 12 kilometers from here, and they all work without pumps. The facade of the Grand Palace is 200 meters long. It was built during the reign of Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter. She spent 20 years on the Russian throne, beginning in 1741, and she spent all of the state's money to build this beautiful architecture. It's said that at her death, she left 15,000 evening gowns she had never worn, 2,000 pairs of shoes, and 5 rubles in cash. Like a real woman, she spent all her money to show off her wealth. And all this money came from the people, from taxes. Life was really hard at the time for farmers and poor people. Serfdom was a form of slavery. Peasants were like merchandise. You could sell them, buy them, give them away. All the way until 1861. The Baroque style was Elizabeth's favorite. It's a sumptuous style with rich decorative elements, moldings and gilded elements everywhere. The typical colors of this style are blue, light green, white, and gold. They say blue is the color of Elizabeth's eyes, white is the color of her skin, and gold the color of her hair. The other prominent architectural style is classical, brought about by Elizabeth's successor, Catherine II, one of the smartest empresses. She didn't spend much on architecture and showcasing. She was more concerned with education. We say that Peter the Great built St. Petersburg, and Catherine II educated it.
But the city has had more than its share of hard times. Abandoned by Stalin, who moved the capital to Moscow, it was bombed repeatedly during the Second World War. The powerful metropolis quickly lost its charm, threatened by destruction.
The city has changed significantly if you compare it to what it was in the early 90s. Chaos and misery prevailed after the fall of the Soviet Union. But more than 20 years have passed, and already there's a huge contrast between then and now.
Perestroika reopened St. Petersburg to the world, and the city's rich cultural heritage can once again be appreciated, particularly through the Hermitage Museum. The museum has over 3 million works of art, including the world's largest painting collection. But only 1/5 of these treasures are displayed here. The rest, that's about 2.5 million works, are in exhibits around the globe or in storages like this one.
The Hermitage is especially rich in European collections. Catherine the Great wanted the Russian Empire to have the culture and splendor of the most important European courts.
With 1,000 display rooms, there's quite a bit to see here. In pure Russian tradition, St. Petersburg wants its residents to understand its cultural richness, offering them access to museums, ballet, and opera for 1/4 of the price paid by tourists.
We're going to a place where the public never goes. Watch your head.
This place, off limits to the public, is where the museum stores its countless frames.
Что, например, сколько одна рамка может стоить?
Ну, это может быть и, скажем, там, 30 тысяч, и 40, и 50 тысяч.
Говорим о долларах.
Долларов, да.
Храните это все для вас. Молодцы.
Спасибо.
Even during the war, when it was emptied of its treasures, nothing prevented locals from visiting the Hermitage. Empty frames probably left room for the imagination.
During the war, the curator of the Dutch painting collection in the Hermitage gave a guided tour of the collection with empty frames, explaining what each painting was before it was removed and sent to the other end of the country for protection. The paintings had been removed, but the frames remained in their proper place. It was Catherine the Great who had the idea of building a theater. The theater could only be accessed through the Imperial Museum. Only her guests were invited in. In fact, this is the only theater in the world without an access from the street or the docks. Works were performed in their original language. You can see the orchestra pit at the bottom, because there wasn't only drama, but also operas in this theater. At the time, you could seat 300 people here. It's still used as a theater today, but now we can sit up to 500 people, for a very obvious reason. The dresses are much smaller than they used to be.
People here have often risked their own lives to defend this incredible cultural heritage. This was the case during the siege of 1941.
As the Germans got closer and the people realized that it was too late to evacuate the works or take them to the city, they buried many of them in the parks and palaces surrounding the museum. Catherine the Great had a cabinet whose walls were covered with panels of amber that came from Germany. When the Germans got here, the panels had been removed and buried in the parks of the palace. After the war, they were never found. Let's go into the basement. There was a dormitory here for the curators who remained in the museum during the war. There was also a permanent guard, and after each bombing, they toured the exhibition rooms to see if there were broken windows. They replaced them with wood or cloth. They removed broken glass, and they kept the museum clean.
Only a few steps from the opulence of the Hermitage, the city has a completely different feel. Unfortunately, behind the facades, St. Petersburg has another, darker side.
The building is collapsing inside, so maybe you notice there are cracks in the walls, so it looks like it's falling apart, and nobody takes care of it.
How long have you been living here?
For 20 years. It's really a privileged area, and when I say I live in Millionnaire Street, people make big eyes and say, oh, it's great. And I say, it's not great. We don't know what to do, either to preserve the main facades and to do the whole reconstruction of the historical areas, or to destroy them, or to let it as it is until it falls apart.
So,
take care.
Be careful.
This is what I mean.
So this is your apartment, but you don't live here?
I don't live here because in the year of 1999, a rich person decided to buy our attic, where all our central heating system goes up. And he destroyed part of our attic, and the water came down here. I started to yell, and I started to write different appeals, because there was water everywhere. They stopped it. But later, he bought some papers that everything was all right from the legal point of view, and he placed metal beams across wooden beams, which were completely decayed. So at the moment, it's dangerous to be here. He was supposed to fix everything, but now it's impossible, because the only way to fix it is to dismantle his structure up there above us. There's no services, no running water, no electricity, nothing.
But you see this fresh water leakage. Hence the buckets.
If the negligence on the inside isn't enough, removing the snow from the thousands of rooftops in the city makes matters even worse. The makeshift tools used to crack through the ice, pierce the roof itself, creating uncontrollable water damage.
Hundreds of buildings are in a rather poor state. They need capital repairs. They need to be fixed.
Can you tell the story of Prince Potemkin?
Prince Potemkin was a favorite of Catherine the Great, the Russian empress. He was a field marshal. When Russians captured the Crimean Peninsula, he invited Catherine the Great to come and to examine. And Potemkin built painted villages. Nobody lived in them, but they were like, you know, theater scenery.
Basically just the walls?
Basically the walls, yes. And Catherine was greatly impressed. And since that time, they started to use that expression as Potemkin's villages to explain things about forgery, about false things, about deceit. We compare this expression with the view of our building. I told you that the main facades look nice. Even the chimneys are painted only on one side. You can see nicely painted chimneys when you sail on the Neva River, or if you walk on the Millionaire Street. But when you get inside, from the upper floors especially, you can see the chimneys are falling apart, like the walls.
In the face of such deterioration, preserving the city's architectural beauty is a daily struggle. The solution lies in the citizens' uncompromising solidarity.
During the Second World War, the city was blocked for about 900 days. It is known as the Siege of Leningrad, and about 2/3 of the population starved to death during that period. But they remained in St. Petersburg because they wanted to protect their city, and they protected these buildings, the museums, the monuments. And right after the war, they started to restore the city. The movement for the protection of cultural heritage started in St. Petersburg back in the beginning of the 20th century, and it was considered as the first legal opposition movement in the Soviet Union.
The population recently found itself under siege by gas giant Gazprom, which planned to build its imposing new headquarters here, potentially changing the face of the city forever.
In 2005, when Gazprom bought a plot of land 5 kilometers from the historic center of St. Petersburg, it announced its decision to build a skyscraper there for its headquarters. And the skyscraper was to be at least 300 meters tall, according to the requirements of the international contest. And after that, the height was even increased. It became 403 meters.
What are the height restrictions now in building in St. Petersburg?
In the place where the Gazprom tower was to be built, the height restriction was 40 meters, according to the federal legislation, and 100 meters according to the regional legislation. And of course, lots of people opposed to this project because the historic center of St. Petersburg is included in the World Heritage List of UNESCO, and UNESCO opposed to this project.
So they could be at risk at losing their heritage status?
Our country was at risk, but Gazprom didn't mind, I think. And the city authorities supported this project, at least our former governor. Well, Petersburgers did not understand that clearly, perhaps. That is why a strong opposition movement appeared, and regular marches in defense of St. Petersburg were held each year. And these marches gathered about 5,000 people.
The people won their case, in a way. The tower will be built farther from the city, but it will now reach a height of 600 meters. Farther out, but higher up. Does that really solve anything? Vermont native Marina Albee moved here more than 20 years ago and runs a vegetarian restaurant in the land of carnivores. She knows only too well how the complexities of St. Petersburg life can make the simplest tasks difficult.
So ordering organic food for your restaurant, simple thing?
Well, there is no organic food in Russia, but I tried to find organic food. I tried to find local food, and I was told, yeah, we can give you carrots, but you have to take 3 tons. Or we can give you potatoes, but you have to take 2 tons. And I don't really have storage facilities. Also, when I investigated the organic food thing, and I was told that you can do organic food. All you have to do is tell the laboratory what result you want when you bring the food to be tested, and you pay for the results.
For you, it's a constant battle to run your restaurant. You were talking about permits you need to open up the terrace every year, and you have a pile of bureaucracy that you have to get through every year.
I used to get very upset by this and very frustrated, but now I just laugh. I've got the mobile phones and the home phone numbers of all the authorities of the city government in all the different organizations, because I go to them and I bring them a bag of cookies, and I sit there and I talk to them about my life. And they give me their phone numbers, and they tell me if you need help, call me. So I managed to get things done just by having friends in different places. So at this point, it's working okay, but it's just the human factor. That's the only thing that works here.
So the rule of law does apply here?
Well, it's hard to say because nobody really knows what the law is. It always changes, and nobody really knows what the current law is. Even the people who make the laws don't know.
It's been 20 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. How have things changed here in St. Petersburg?
Things change here every day, every minute, every second. Everything has completely changed in 20 years. Everything is turned upside down, you could say. The old days, the foreigners had the know-how, but now the Russians have it. So they don't need foreigners, and they don't need foreign money. Especially now, if you look at Europe and the United States, the economies, the Russians are sitting pretty compared to them. So, you know, they can wag their finger and say, I told you so. But, you know, it's possible to do something here, but it's very difficult. And it's not for people who have weak nerves, that's for sure. It's a beautiful city. It was built to be like a theater, like a theatrical set. So when you're walking around the streets, you feel like you're in a play. You feel like you're an actor in a play. And this is your set. I love this city. I think it's one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
What's the cost of living like now in St. Petersburg?
Well, I mean, the prices in restaurants and stores are higher than in Europe. But it's possible to live here for very little money, if you know how. Almost all my friends are artists or musicians. You know, they don't have jobs, they don't have money, but somehow they live very well.
Is it still the cultural center of Russia?
Well, Moscow has 80% of the money. It's like Paris in France. But the real artists and the great artistic works have always come from St. Petersburg for some reason. The classical arts are flourishing here, and I think the Russians still have got, you know, the best performers in the world in that sense. I lived in New York for 10 years, and then I lived in Moscow for 5. Moscow is a huge city. Everyone feels like a little ant there. It's what they call gigantism style of architecture, where it makes people feel very small. Like the Communist Party is the big thing, then people are very small. You don't feel that way in St. Petersburg. It's a much more livable city. St. Petersburg and Moscow have always been rivals, but Muscovites have a hard time in the cultural sphere. And if you look at the heroes of Russian show business and culture, most of the people are from St. Petersburg. So I think part of that is because St. Petersburg was not touched to the degree that Moscow was. And it didn't get caught up in this capitalistic frenzy to make money or succeed or have power or whatever, if you're talking about communist times.
Africa! Привет! Это я.
St. Petersburg may be the cultural capital of Russia, but before the fall of the Soviet Union, it wasn't really in contact with the outside world.
Hello.
My friend, artist Sergei Bugayev, also known as Africa, was active here before and after this major shift.
First, we probably have to understand we are talking about the birth of New Russia. We are not talking about the continuation of something else, even though it's not possible to not continue everything else. But not too many people in the world, or even in Russia, understand right now we have a process of building of new country.
How different was it being an artist before the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Just one image. Only members of the Union of the Artists are allowed to buy oil and canvas. So in order to buy oil, colors, we will wait by the shop to see somebody who look like a member of the Union of the Artists, and we will ask, can you please buy us with your papers some colors? Now, of course, you can buy as much as you like.
Did St. Petersburg always have more cultural freedom than Moscow?
Even in the Soviet time, the intelligentsia in Leningrad were more progressive, more open. I don't know, but a lot of people will complain about this. But there was the underground life in Leningrad were much stronger. And what was even stronger, the unity between the rock and roll, the free jazz, artists, poets and writers. It was one thing, because in the Soviet Union, people are not divided by money,
There are so many libraries, museums, concert halls, theaters in St. Petersburg. It seems like on every street corner you can find one. Are they still viable?
In my opinion, a lot of institutions related to theater are kind of old-fashioned, For centuries, the culture was mainly engined by the censorship. Right now, Russia experiencing freedom, and it's
So what's going to happen to culture?
It's not simple. Nobody knows what to do with it, and some people are saying maybe we don't need it because it's too difficult to operate. And that's the competition and the crossroad we're experiencing right now. It's completely new for Russia. It's not an easy thing, even though we have a great tradition, a great experience in the avant-garde art, in the experimental field of ideas. It's probably first time in Russia history, again, that you can go anywhere in the world. You can read any text. It was never possible before. 18th century, not possible. 19th century, not possible. 20th century, not possible. Right now, you can buy every book. There's no limitation, anything. You name it, what do you like? Bible, okay. Even the books you don't want to mention, like Mein Kampf, it was available.
Tell me about your Lenin project.
I was a member of the Young Men's Lenin organization in the Soviet Union. Everybody was. So I had some strange attachment to the image of Lenin. And I started to buy images of Lenin. And then, by accident, in Vienna, somebody forced me to take from them a collection of things related to John Lennon. I said, no, I'm collecting Lenin. And I found these two individuals are extremely illustrative for the 20th century. This type of leader screaming to the microphone like John Lennon did or like Lenin did. Their individual speech addressing to huge amounts of people. People from the Beatles club. They said, you cannot put devil with the angel. I said, who is devil, who is angel? My collection started here with death masks, and then it went all the way up. In my collection, the largest is a 3-meter monument in the storage, so I'm not able to put it here. 6 tons.
Lenin may be long gone, but the Soviet influence is still very much alive. The kommunalki, residential communes from the Soviet times, are still very present in modern-day St. Petersburg. Sociologist Ilya Utyekhin lived the first 30 years of his life in a kommunalka with 50 other people.
Several families live in the same apartment, sharing all the facilities, but having separate rooms. that's generally communalka. And communalka comes from the Soviet times when Bolsheviks made the revolution here. One of their ideas in their program was to redistribute the housing according to class principle, so that to kick out the rich people from their housing and put the workers there. And the slogan was, give palaces to people. In the very beginning, putting people together was purely ideological gesture. There was no necessity because the population of this city before the First World War was 2.5 million. And in the first years after the revolution, it was 600,000. So many apartments stayed empty. There is nothing special about living together, many people in the same place. But what is special about Soviet communalkas? People from different social groups, different ethnic groups, religions. They had no choice, they live together. And there is no idea that brings them together. Housing was a way of control of people's mobility.
The most important word in Soviet times, propiska.
Propiska, yeah. By the way, I've got propiska until now. That is my passport. You can read зарегистрирован. In the Soviet times, this is a residency permit for this address, but at the same time, this is a prohibition to live elsewhere.
So did everybody live in communalkas in the Soviet period?
No, this city, up to 70% lived in that way. But there was an elite who lived in separate apartment. Of course, a separate apartment was a recognition of your elite status.
Like all residences in the country, the Tolstoy house went through a major change in the early stages of the communist era. Overnight, it became a giant complex of communes.
All the apartments in this building were communalkas during the Soviet epoch. Now, after perestroika, when privatization started, many of them were bought out by real estate agencies. And new Russians, rich people who could afford to buy such kind of apartment are living here in the former communalkas.
So you can find a little bit of everything here.
Oh, you can still find here communal apartments that are remaining. But you see, this courtyard, there are many very expensive cars. So they belong to the people who live here by the side with communalkas. Until now, more than 100 apartments in the city are communal apartments. This is according to official data. More than 600,000 people live together in apartments like that.
What does it cost on average for a room in a communal apartment?
It can be $100 or $200 a month, but you should keep in mind that this price is 1/3 or 1/4 of a monthly income of a person. So that's a fair price.
Inside the Tolstoy house, we're greeted by Olga, who has lived here for 24 years.
Each family had their own doorbell buttons. So 6 families lived in this apartment, and one of them was a general one.
Здравствуйте, Ольга.
Ольга, здравствуйте.
До конца
Да.
коридора.
Вечер, добрый вечер. Сколько сейчас людей проживают в этой квартире?
Я думаю, 13 человек. Это мало.
И раньше сколько людей жило?
Вот после войны здесь до 40 человек жило.
А сколько комнат?
8.
8 комнат, да? И вот там было 40 человек.
Да.
Типичная кухня здесь.
Вот раньше в наших коммуналках такие кухни были везде. Только плиты стояли вот такие.
Скажите, пожалуйста, когда ты стала в коммунальной квартире после революции, хозяин этого дома или этой квартиры хотел пригласить всю семью сюда?
После революции, где-то в 30-х годах, когда пошло уплотнение, он решил, что лучше жить с роднёй, чем с чужими людьми в одной квартире. Он собрал свою родню с России.
They try to partition their space to get privatized sections in a big space. Here, if you have a family, so someone can make some homework here and watching television in another place, sleeping.
Вы живете в этой комнате с кем?
Здесь 3 детей моих живут. 2 сына, дочка с внучкой. А я с бывшим мужем, с разведенным, в другой комнате.
Так что вы не хотите отсюда уехать, да?
Хотим, очень. Да? Покупателей на квартиру нету.
Почему?
Потому
это
что
центр
дорого
города.
стоит. Дорого стоит. Самый престижный дом в городе.
Да. И никто не хочет платить те деньги, которые вы хотите?
Все-таки сейчас с кризисом как-то покупателей меньше стало.
Понятно. Здесь есть общий туалет?
Да.
Да. Можно посмотреть?
Пожалуйста.
У всех есть свое сведение?
Кто как. Кто очень брезгливый, тот свое носит. А так одно общее лежит.
Traditionally, in many communal apartments, there was a different system. There were several switches and several bulbs inside of the toilet. Because of electricity expenditure, each family had their own bulb in the washroom or in the toilet, and they used their own electricity. Sometimes people had the switches in their rooms and bulbs here. Because here everyone can use your electricity, and you switch on the light in your room and come here to use the toilet. But there is another problem. You can switch on the light, but some other person can get in before you.
In 1991, following the fall of the Soviet Union, the state established a system to privatize the kommunalki. In theory, with a proof of residency, it's supposed to be easy to appropriate the space you live in. But in St. Petersburg, things are never quite that simple.
Вы надеетесь на то, что государство может расселить это?
Государство сюда не сунется. Нам, как говорили, 8 миллионов вот на нашу долю, наша доля в этой квартире. 8 миллионов при расселении всей квартиры. А мне нужно всех отдельно поселить.
Ваши комнаты приватизированы?
Нет. Смысл какой? Ведь на эти деньги только однокомнатную квартиру.
Действительно?
Да.
Но ведь все-таки в таком доме?
Ну, 6 человек в однокомнатную квартиру.
А 6 человек?
6 человек. Прописано-то у меня 6 человек.
А кто шестой? Ваш муж?
Трое детей, внучка и я.
In the same building, just a few doors down, we get a clear picture of the contrasts that characterize the city. It's a very different way of life here.
Heidi, очень приятно.
This is a former communalka. You see, some years before, several families lived here, but now it seems to be completely renovated. And you can easily imagine, no, not easily, imagine how this room could be partitioned.
Ну, вы знаете, мы перепланировали абсолютно все. Тут было, наверное, комнат 20.
Комнат 20, ага.
Да-да-да, и они были длинные, и получалось то, что один коридор разделялся. Ага. Коридорного типа, видимо, это коммуналка была. И жило очень много народу.
То есть коридор...
Сколько людей примерно жили здесь?
Так что было чуть ли не 20 человек. Просто.
И теперь сколько людей здесь живут?
Сейчас 2 родителей мои и я. Так что мы втроем.
To gain ownership of this apartment, Victoria's father had to relocate its former occupants, all 20 of them. So it's come full circle. The revolution took the home of a wealthy family and gave it to the people. Today, 75 years later, the wealthy are moving back in. Massive, beautiful, and damaged, St. Petersburg endured a history of power struggle, conflict, and war. Torn between the modernity of its European neighbors and the complexity of its Russian past, the glimmering metropolis is now undergoing a new revolution. It is redefining itself and reclaiming its role as Russia's cultural capital.